If you've ever been confused about coconut oil, you're not alone. On one side, best-selling authors like Dr. Bruce Fife call it a miracle food, a cure-all for your brain, your heart, your energy. On the other, the American Heart Association issues stark warnings, calling it a dangerous risk, worse than butter, for your arteries. Who's right? This isn't just academic. This is about what you stir into your coffee, what you cook your eggs in, what you trust with your health. And the answer isn't a simple yes or no. The real truth is hiding in the chemistry of the oil itself, in something called MCTs, or medium-chain triglycerides. Because here's what both sides often miss. Not all coconut oil is created equal. The miracle claims are tied to a specific type of MCT. The risk warnings are tied to another fat that makes up most of the jar in your pantry. You could be using the exact wrong kind for your goals. In the next few minutes, we're cutting through the hype and the fear. I'll show you the proven science of what MCTs can and cannot do, reveal the critical difference between refined and virgin oil, and give you my simple evidence-based verdict: when coconut oil is a smart tool, and when it's a serious mistake. The truth is in the details. Let's find it. All right, let's talk about coconut oil. You know, it feels like every few years there's a new headline, a new study, and suddenly everyone's either singing its praises or warning us to stay far, far away. Back in June of 2017, a huge voice in the heart health world, the American Heart Association, put out a presidential advisory that was pretty clear. They weren't recommending coconut oil. This wasn't a new battle. This back and forth about whether it's a health hero or a heart health villain has been raging for decades. Even as a doctor teaching prevention, I wrestled with this. But here's where things get interesting. Digging into the research, I found compelling evidence from experts, like a respected epidemiologist, that made me seriously question the AHA's conclusions. We're not here for an emotional debate. We're here to ask, who's really got it right? We'll cut through the myths, examine the meta-analyses, and give you the final verdict on how coconut oil fits into your health plan. Now, this wasn't some brand new battle. Oh no. This has been going on for decades. This back and forth about whether coconut oil is a health hero or a heart health villain. I even have my own little history with it. Growing up, I absolutely loved coconut. My mom and my grandma, who were a big part of my childhood, always knew that my favorite birthday treat was anything coconut. Coconut pie, coconut cake. Yeah, we definitely had a sweet tooth culture in our family, but that's a story for another day. When I became a doctor and started teaching about prevention, I learned that coconut oil was packed with saturated fat. And back then, the general thinking was that saturated fats were the bad guys. So I pretty much stopped using coconut oil, only having it very, very rarely. But here's where things get interesting. I was digging around, doing some research for this conversation, and I stumbled upon some of the arguments and criticisms leveled against the American Heart Association's advice. And honestly, my first thought was, oh boy, here we go again. Another emotional debate, more shouting than actual clear information. But I was genuinely surprised by this one blogger who really made me rethink things. Her name is Hilda Bastian. She's involved in public health research in Australia and has also worked here in the U.S. She's been an epidemiologist at the National Institutes of Health at some pretty high levels, and she was even a founding member of the Cochrane Collaboration. You know, that global kind of Wikipedia for scientific evidence. This was part of the PLOS, the Public Library of Science. She's pretty sharp, and as an epidemiologist, she's even got a bit of a comedic take on the field, which I appreciate. I think she really gets a lot of the frustrating issues we deal with, like the whole coconut oil saga. What she criticized the American Heart Association for was twofold. First, she pointed out potential bias. Apparently, there were financial connections within the organization, and they even had a page dedicated to disclosing these financial ties. But it wasn't just that. She also criticized their selection of studies, noting that there wasn't a clear list of all the research they actually looked at. Second, she argued that they seemed to be applying different standards or criteria when evaluating different studies. Now again, this woman is an experienced epidemiologist. Honestly, I found some of her analysis of the AHA's work more convincing than the AHA's own conclusions. But let's keep digging and look at some other angles on this whole coconut oil question. Who's really got it right? Okay, so then you have groups like the Center for Science and the Public Interest. You'd think, well, a public interest group, they're probably pretty neutral, right? Wrong. They've been around for a while and they've spent a good chunk of their existence involved in political battles. Now, their take on coconut oil is that there are a lot of persistent myths out there. For example, the idea that coconut oil helps you lose weight. Well, that might be a little simplistic. It could help with weight loss if it leads to an overall decrease in calorie intake, maybe compared to some other diets. And it really depends on how much coconut oil you're actually using. Myth number 2. According to them, coconut oil is good for your heart. And myth number 3, coconut oil protects you from dementia. Now, I would agree that there's a point to be made about these statements being myths, at least in their absolute form. I don't think the final verdict is in on all of this yet. I still think there are debatable points. This whole thing feels a bit like, well, it's complicated. Here's something interesting. This is, I believe, a meta-analysis from the British Medical Journal. It's in their open access section called Open Heart, which focuses on cardiovascular disease. They brought up a few points. They looked at MCTs, the medium-chain triglycerides or fatty acids. Now they suggested that MCTs do seem to offer some benefits compared to long-chain fatty acids. However, they also cautioned that these benefits might be limited, and while they might not be particularly harmful, they're also not likely to be a miracle cure. So, their overall message seemed to be, yeah, you can use them, but don't expect it to be a super-duper fix. And if you're vegan, or maybe even if you eat animal products, you might want to brace yourself for this part. This comes from the Asian Australasian Journal of Animal Sciences. They were looking at carcass composition and serum lipids in male broilers, basically chickens being raised for meat. And their key finding was that if these chickens had too much soybean oil in their diet, they ended up with too much fat in their bodies. What they found was that you could actually decrease the amount of fat by replacing about 75% of the soybean oil with coconut oil. If these researchers are using coconut oil to reduce body fat in chickens, it definitely makes you stop and think. Now, when you start digging into the coconut oil debate, you'll often hear about cis fats being good and trans fats being bad. So, what are those exactly? These terms refer to the arrangement of hydrogen atoms around the double bonds in unsaturated fatty acids. If you have hydrogen atoms at every carbon in the chain, then it's a saturated fat. Cis fats are generally considered to be healthier. Their molecular structure has a bend or kink. Trans fats, on the other hand, are generally considered harmful. Now, where does coconut oil fit in? It's neither. Again, this highlights how it can become a very detailed and complex argument. As I mentioned a moment ago, coconut oil is a saturated fat. These other structures I showed are unsaturated. One is a cis fat, and the other is a trans fat. There have been long-standing arguments, especially from public interest science groups, pushing for regulations to remove saturated fats from the American diet, and then later, to remove trans fats. Now, there's even some discussion about re-evaluating saturated fats. The key difference with coconut oil is the presence of lauric acid, a medium-chain fatty acid. Let me quickly illustrate the difference between chain lengths. This is roughly a 17-carbon chain, a long-chain fatty acid. Short-chain fatty acids are typically shorter, maybe around 8 to 12 carbons. I'm not entirely precise on the exact numbers. And just to complete the picture, if you link 3 of these fatty acids together with a glycerol molecule, you get a triglyceride, the kind of blood fats we often talk about. When you break down triglycerides, you can enter ketosis, which is what happens in diabetics who can't utilize sugar properly. It's also the goal of early stages of a low-carb diet when you're not burning much sugar. We actually produce ketones every time our bodies burn fat. Speaking of meta-analyses, here's one specifically looking at coconut oil consumption and cardiovascular risk factors. It included 8 clinical trials and 13 observational studies. Their findings: coconut oil tends to increase LDL cholesterol levels. Now, the pro-coconut oil folks might argue, yeah, but it increases HDL cholesterol even more. However, when you actually look at the studies, there isn't a whole lot of robust data measuring the ratio of LDL to HDL, so that claim isn't very well supported yet. Here's their conclusion. The weight of the evidence from intervention studies suggests that replacing coconut oil with cis-unsaturated fats would alter blood lipids in a manner consistent with a reduction in risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So, this particular meta-analysis was clearly one that was cited by the anti-coconut oil groups, like the Center for Science in the Public Interest. The bottom line, at least in my opinion, is that the results are still not entirely clear-cut either way. And here's another bottom line that might sound a bit surprising. Why does all this intense debate even matter that much? This graph shows coconut consumption in the United States, starting way back in 1964 and going up to 2016. And as you can see, yes, there's been a little bit of an increase in recent years, but it's not really a dramatic surge. It kind of feels like a big storm in a very small teacup. First, hit the like button so the truth about this nutritional dilemma can reach more people fighting misinformation. Second, click subscribe and ring that notification bell. By joining the Dr. Lab community, you ensure you never miss our breakdown of health controversies, allowing you to build your health on evidence, not headlines. Tell me in the comments, will you be using coconut oil now or sticking to other fats? Let's continue the conversation. Thank you.